Ethan Doyle and his wife Clara craved a fresh start, a quiet escape from the constant hum of city life. After years bouncing between cramped apartments, the small cottage they found on the edge of a Vermont forest felt like a deep, cleansing breath. The locals called it the Frost Cottage, a place that had stood empty for decades. Its stone chimney leaned just a little, a testament to time, and the wooden porch sagged like tired shoulders. But the air had smelled of pine and recent rain, a scent so pure it felt alive. This was their peace. Ethan had landed a job teaching art at the local high school, while Clara, a talented illustrator, could work on her children's books from their new home. Their first week was a whirlwind of unpacking boxes and sharing laughter over the house's quirks. The floors creaked like an old man's knees with every step, a sound they found charming. It was all perfect, until Clara decided the living room needed a fresh coat of paint. As she began peeling back the loose, faded wallpaper, she discovered something strange. Beneath the surface, the plaster wasn't smooth. There were uneven bumps, like a hidden relief map running under the wall. At first, Ethan dismissed it as simple moisture damage, nothing to worry about. But as Clara traced the shapes with her fingers, a chill ran down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat. The bumps weren't random at all. They formed the distinct outline of a nose, the high curve of cheekbones, and a pair of lips, slightly parted, as if frozen mid-whisper. By the third evening, Clara's unease had grown into certainty. "Ethan," she'd said, her voice strained, "I see faces in the walls." He just smiled, trying to soothe her. "Honey, you've been staring at paint swatches for too long." But his reassurance did little to calm her nerves. She started keeping the lights on, even during the bright daylight hours. The shadows in their new home had started to feel watchful. Whenever Ethan left for work, a profound sense of isolation would wash over Clara. She swore she could hear faint whispers, her name being called from within the cracks of the old plaster. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a presence. One morning, their neighbor, a kind but reserved man named Mr. Baird, stopped by. He carried a jar of golden honey as a welcome gift, but his eyes held a quiet warning. He told Ethan the story of the man who built the Frost Cottage, a sculptor named Alden Frost. The town's folklore painted a grim picture. They said Alden went mad after his wife suddenly vanished without a trace. No one knew what became of him. Either he just stopped appearing in town one day. Years later, when the property was finally sold, no one dared to ask too many questions. The cottage held its secrets close. That night, the unease in the house thickened. Clara didn't come to bed. The hours ticked by, and just after midnight, Ethan was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was a rhythmic scraping, like a trowel being dragged against concrete. He crept downstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He found her in the living room, standing before the wall, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. Her hand was pressed flat against the plaster. "Someone's whispering from inside it," she murmured, her voice hollow. Ethan grabbed her shoulders, trying to pull her away, but her eyes were fixed, unblinking, on the wall. She turned to him, her expression eerily calm, and whispered, "They're asking to be finished." The next day was a nightmare. Ethan pleaded with her to leave, to just spend a few days at a hotel, away from the house. But Clara refused. She looked at him with an intensity that scared him and said she could abandon them. The faces in the wall. When Ethan returned from work that evening, the heavy, damp smell of wet plaster hit him the moment he opened the door. The living room was a chaotic scene. Buckets of mixed compound littered the floor, and sculpting tools, brushes, chisels, trowels were scattered everywhere. And the wall. The wall had been transformed. The vague, bumpy shapes he'd seen before were now terrifyingly detailed. Each face was perfectly formed, their expressions frozen in a silent scream of anguish. Their eyes were hollowed out, deep and dark, staring into the room. It was as if the wall had swallowed real people, their torment forever etched into the plaster. "Clara!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He ran from room to room, his calls echoing through the empty house. Her shoes were still by the door. Her phone lay on the kitchen table. He was about to run outside when he heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from behind the wall. rhythmic, soft, like knuckles knocking from the inside. He pressed his ear against the cold, damp plaster, and then he heard it. Her voice, a muffled, desperate whisper, calling his name. Ethan. Primal fear gave way to adrenaline. He grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and began tearing at the wall, screaming her name, his blows raining down on the plaster faces. A large section finally gave way, crumbling to the floor, and beneath it, something pale and wet gleamed in the dim light. It wasn't paint, it wasn't plaster, it was skin, cold, waxy, and unmistakably human. A mouth hung open behind the broken plaster, and from it came the faintest sigh, like an exhale of ancient dust. Hours later, when the police arrived, they found Ethan sitting on the floor of the living room, his hands caked in white plaster dust, his eyes vacant. He just kept muttering that he was helping Clara finish the faces. They searched the entire property, every inch of the house and the surrounding woods, but they found no trace of Clara. The room was filled with the cloying, earthy smell of lime and damp soil. As the officers led Ethan away, Mr. Baird stood at the edge of the porch, a silent observer. He kept his gaze fixed on the house, recalling the stories his grandfather used to tell about Alden Frost's peculiar art. He remembered his grandfather saying that Alden always claimed his sculptures breathed with the life of his beloved. That night, after the police cars had gone and silence once again descended upon the Frost cottage, something inside the living room wall shifted. On the newest face, the one Ethan had started to uncover, a faint crack appeared in the drying plaster. And through that crack, two small, terrified eyes slowly opened. Thank you for watching. If stories that send a shiver down your spine are what you live for, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a new tale from the shadows. Stay safe and see you next time. Liam Rowe thought a fresh start would help his daughter heal. After his wife's sudden death, the small apartment they'd lived in felt haunted not by ghosts, but by memories. So when he found a townhouse for rent on a quiet street in Maine, he signed the papers without hesitation. The house was old but solid, with tall windows and a tiny garden that his 6-year-old daughter Nina immediately fell in love with. Their landlady, Mrs. Fairchild, was kind in a distant way. She wore heavy perfume and always seemed to be clutching something in her hands keys. Usually, when she gave Liam the tour, she stopped before a narrow door at the end of the upstairs hall. "Don't open this one," she said firmly. "The floor's not safe in there. I've meant to have it repaired, but I never got around to it. Best to leave it locked." Liam nodded. He wasn't the type to question a landlord's rules. Besides, they didn't need the extra space. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. Liam worked long shifts as a paramedic while Nina adjusted to her new school. At night, they'd watch old cartoons and eat dinner on the couch. For the first time in months, the house felt peaceful. Then the drawings began. One evening, while Liam was cleaning the kitchen, Nina came running in, her hands smudged with crayons. "Dad, look, I drew my new friend." The picture showed two children, one clearly her, and beside her, a boy with black eyes and gray skin. Above his head, she'd written Oren. "That's nice, sweetheart," Liam said gently. "Who's Oren?" "He lives upstairs," she said. "He can't come down because he's cold." Liam felt a shiver, but forced a smile. "Maybe you mean the neighbor's kid." Nina shook her head. "No, he lives in the room you said is broken." He stopped what he was doing and looked toward the staircase, the locked nursery. That night, after putting Nina to bed, he stood outside the forbidden door. The house was silent except for the occasional groan of pipes. He knelt down and pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing, just stillness, he told himself. It was all in Nina's imagination. Kids her age made up friends all the time. But the next night, he heard something that made his stomach twist. A slow, rhythmic thump from behind the locked door. Then another. Then silence. Liam unlocked his phone and opened a baby monitor app he still had from when Nina was little. The next day, he bought a cheap camera and set it up facing the hallway. When he checked the footage later that night, his breath caught. The door to the locked room had moved slightly, but enough to see the faint crack of darkness between the frame and the jamb. He called Mrs. Fairchild the next morning. I thought you said the door was locked, he said. Her voice was tight. It is, well, it's not anymore. Someone's been in there. A long pause followed. Mr. Rowe, she said finally, please don't go in. There's old damage. It's unsafe. I'll come by soon and check it myself. But she didn't. That night, Liam woke to the sound of Nina talking in her sleep. He crept to a doorway and froze. She was sitting upright in bed, whispering, he says it's warm down here. He wants to come play. The next morning, the nursery door was wide open. Inside, sunlight poured through cracked curtains onto a dust-covered crib, a wooden rocking horse, and piles of forgotten toys. It looked untouched for decades, but the air was strangely cold, like a refrigerator left open. On the floor was a single small footprint, pressed into the dust. Liam backed away slowly, shut the door, and locked it again. That night, the thumping returned louder, this time, faster. He heard a faint laugh, high-pitched and childlike. He grabbed a flashlight, his hands shaking, and walked upstairs. The door stood open again. He shone the light inside. The rocking horse was moving on its own, creaking back and forth. Then he saw a figure sitting in the corner, a small boy with pale skin and blackened eyes. Who are you? Liam whispered. The boy tilted his head. Oren. I told her I'd come down. Liam stumbled backward. Where's Nina? She's showing me the garden, the boy said, his voice echoing like wind through a tunnel. Liam bolted down the stairs, shouting her name, but the house was empty. Her room, her bed, her shoes all there. But she was gone. When Mrs. Fairchild arrived the next morning, she found the door to the nursery splintered and the floor caved in. The police searched for 2 days, but found nothing except the baby monitor camera. Still recording, the last few minutes of footage showed the empty nursery. Then the rocking horse began to move. Slowly, softly, a child's voice whispered, "Thank you for letting me out." The horse stopped rocking, and the feed went black. Julian Grant had seen plenty of strange homes through his camera lens, but nothing like the Glassford estate. The luxury property sat at the edge of a quiet Oregon forest, untouched since construction finished 3 years ago. The developer wanted new photos to relaunch the sale, and Julian, an architectural photographer, was the man for the job. His girlfriend Tessa came along to help with lighting and staging. From the outside, the house looked ordinary: sharp lines, pale stone walls, and wide glass panels that caught every glint of daylight. But inside, it was something else entirely. Every room had mirrors, enormous ones, stretching from floor to ceiling, some even built into the walls themselves. Kind of narcissistic, isn't it? Tessa joked, running her hand along a mirrored hallway. Julian laughed. Guess the owner liked seeing himself everywhere. They set up their equipment, moving from room to room. The mirrors made the house feel endless, like walking through reflections of reflections. Every time Julian turned, he caught sight of himself from a dozen angles. It was dizzying, but he tried to focus on the job. By late afternoon, the light was perfect. He stood in the grand living room, framing the fireplace and the glossy surfaces around it. As he adjusted the lens, something in the reflection caught his eye. Someone was standing behind him. He spun around, instantly nothing there. The room was empty. He looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone. Tessa noticed his face pale. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he lied. "Just thought I saw you behind me. I've been over here the whole time." He laughed it off and kept shooting. But as the day went on, small inconsistencies started creeping in. In one mirror, his reflection lagged behind by half a second. In another, he could swear he saw movement in the corners even when he and Tessa were perfectly still. When they wrapped up, Julian checked the photos on his laptop. To his surprise, the figures weren't in any of them. Every shot looked clean, perfect symmetry, perfect emptiness. They stayed overnight in a nearby rental cabin, and that's when things turned unsettling. While editing, Julian paused on one image, the wide hallway with the twin mirrors on each side. If he brightened the exposure just slightly, he could make out faint handprints on the glass. Dozens of them, some small, some large, all pressed flat as though from the other side. He turned off the computer. "We're going back tomorrow," he said. Tessa groaned. "You're kidding. We've got enough shots." "There's something weird about that place. I just need to check one thing." They returned the next morning. The house was cold and still, even though the sun was blazing outside. Dust floated in the air, catching the light from the massive windows in the main hall. Julian touched one of the mirrors. The glass was icy. His breath fogged it, leaving a faint patch of mist that lingered too long. Tessa walked ahead. "Julian, look at this." He followed her voice to the dining room. Every mirror there had changed. Instead of reflecting the room, they all showed vague shapes behind the glass outlines of people. Dozens of them, pressed close, their faces blurred as though trapped beneath ice. Tessa backed away, whispering, "They're looking at us." Julian raised his camera instinctively and took a shot. The flash lit up the room for half a second, and in that instant, every reflection turned its head toward them. The camera slipped from his hands and hit the floor. One of the figures began moving, its face flattening against the glass. A deep crack spidered across the surface, and then another, spreading like veins. The sound echoed through the room. "Julian," Tessa said, her voice trembling, "we need to go." But Julian couldn't move. He was staring into his own reflection, and it wasn't mirroring him anymore. It stood perfectly still while he took a step back. Then it smiled. He felt his breath catch. His reflection lifted its hand and pressed it against the other side of the glass. The mirror rippled, just slightly. Tessa screamed and ran for the door. But as Julian turned, his reflection moved, faster, grabbing his arm from inside the glass. He felt a pull, sharp and cold, like being dragged into freezing water. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was Tessa's terrified face, her reflection staring at him from the mirror beside hers, smiling. The next morning, police arrived after a neighbor reported a car still parked at the property. They found the cameras scattered across the floor. No sign of Julian or Tessa. Detective Arlo Penn reviewed the footage from Julian's camera. The final photo showed the empty dining room, sunlight glinting off the shattered glass. In every broken shard, two figures stood side by side, smiling faintly, faces that shouldn't have been there at all. And in the reflection of the cracked window behind them, dozens more were watching.